She recognized the fabric before she recognized the feeling. It was laid across the bed in Mrs. Ivey's guest chamber like something poured there, pale blue silk that caught the late afternoon light and turned it to water. Silver thread traced a pattern along the bodice and hem that Thea could not name, but that seemed, in the way of very fine work, to have been stitched by someone who understood restraint. Not embroidery that announced itself, embroidery that waited to be found. It belonged to a woman who had no further use for it, Mrs. Ivey said from the doorway, and there was something careful in the phrasing that Thea might have noticed had she not already been running her hand across the skirt and thinking only that she had never touched anything so fine in her life. Mrs. Ivey was her mother's cousin, twice removed, or perhaps 3 times. The connection had been explained to Thea in a letter that arrived the previous autumn, when her father's death had left her with a small house in Hertfordshire, an even smaller income, and no reason whatsoever to be in London. Mrs. Ivey had written to offer what she called a season of proximity, not a sponsorship, not a formal introduction, merely a bed and a borrowed address from which Thea might attend certain gatherings where the company would be tolerable and the expectations modest. Thea had accepted because the alternative was a winter of counting candles. The ball was Lady Whitwell's, and it was not the sort of occasion to which Thea would ordinarily have been invited. Mrs. Ivey moved in circles adjacent to the aristocracy, close enough to receive cards, distant enough that her attendance was a courtesy rather than an expectation. The gown had been offered that morning, when Thea confessed she had nothing suitable. "You are nearly her height," Mrs. Ivey had said, and opened the wardrobe as if the matter were settled. Thea did not ask whose wardrobe had supplied it. She did not think to. A woman newly arrived in London, with 2 day dresses and a pelisse that had belonged to her mother, does not interrogate generosity. She accepts it with the quiet gratitude of someone who understands that the distance between dignity and charity is measured in the asking. The dress fit as though it had been made for her. The sleeves sat precisely at the shoulder. The empire waist fell where it ought. The pale blue silk, which she'd expected to wash her out, she was fair, with light brown hair that resisted arrangement, instead did something unexpected to her coloring. It made her look like mourning. She did not know this. She knew only that the fabric did not pull and the hem did not drag, and that when she descended the staircase into Mrs. Ivey's front hall, the older woman looked at her for a very long time and then said, "Yes, that will do." The ballroom at Whitwell House was larger than Thea had anticipated, and considerably warmer. She had been to dances in Hertfordshire, country assemblies where the musicians were enthusiastic and the refreshments were warm lemonade, but nothing that involved 400 candles, a string quartet playing Haydn, and a receiving line that took 11 minutes to pass through. Mrs. Ivey steered her through with practiced efficiency, introducing her as Miss Kinross, my young relation from the country, which was both true and strategically vague. Thea found a position near the far wall where the candlelight was less direct and the crowd less dense, and she watched. She was good at watching. Her father had been a clergyman of modest means and considerable intellect, and he had raised her on the principle that observation was the beginning of understanding. She had spent her childhood watching parishioners, watching weather, watching the way light moved across the nave of his church at different hours. She brought that same attentiveness to Lady Whitwell's ballroom, and what she saw was a room performing itself, every gesture calculated, every laugh placed, every position in the room a statement about where one stood in the order of things. She did not see the Duke of Whitmore until he had already seen her. Lawrence Drayton had not intended to attend. He had accepted the invitation 6 weeks earlier, in a moment of resolve that had since evaporated, and he had spent the carriage ride to Whitwell House composing plausible excuses for an early departure. His valet had pressed his evening coat. His steward, Selby, had reminded him that Lord Whitwell sat on the same committee in the House of Lords, and the continued absence from social occasions was beginning to attract comment. His housekeeper, Mrs. Cull, had said nothing at all, which was her way of saying everything. 3 years. Emmeline had been dead for 3 years, and the world had decided that this was sufficient. That grief, like a season, had a prescribed duration, and his had exceeded it. He did not agree. But he had stopped arguing, because arguing required energy he no longer possessed, and because the people who told him it was time were not wrong, they were merely irrelevant. Time did not enter into it. The question was not how long, but how completely, and the answer was entirely. He saw the dress from across the ballroom. Later, he would try to reconstruct the sequence, what he had been doing, where he had been standing, what had drawn his eye. He had been speaking with Lord Asherton near the second pillar. He had turned, perhaps to set down his glass, perhaps to answer a remark from someone passing. And there it was. Pale blue silk, silver embroidery along the bodice and hem, a pattern of trailing leaves that Emmeline's mother had commissioned from a seamstress in Lyon. The specific weight of the fabric, the way it moved when the woman wearing it, shifted her weight from one foot to the other. He knew that movement. He had watched it 1,000 times across 1,000 rooms. He knew the exact way that silk caught candlelight, because he had once told Emmeline that she looked like she had been dipped in moonlight, and she had laughed and said that was the most ridiculous thing anyone had ever said to her, and then she had worn the dress to every ball for the rest of the season. The rest of the season. The last season. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. Lord Asherton continued for a moment before realizing he had lost his audience, and by then Lawrence was already moving, not toward her, not away, but into a kind of stillness that had nothing to do with his body and everything to do with the fact that the room had just rearranged itself around a single point, and he could not look at anything else. The woman in the dress was not Emmeline. He knew this. Emmeline had been dark-haired and sharp-featured, and she had moved through rooms like weather. You felt her before you saw her. This woman was lighter, quieter, standing against the wall with the careful posture of someone who was trying very hard not to take up space. She was watching the room with an expression he recognized but could not place, attentive without hunger, present without performance. She was wearing his dead wife's dress, and she had no idea. Thea became aware of being watched the way one becomes aware of a draft, gradually, and then all at once. She turned her head and found a man standing perhaps 30 feet away, looking at her with an expression that was not admiration, not curiosity, not any of the things she had been taught to expect from a man's gaze at a ball. It was something closer to recognition, and it frightened her because she had never seen him before in her life. He was tall, dark-haired, perhaps 35, with the kind of face that had been assembled by good bones and poor sleep. His evening coat was immaculate. His posture was that of a man who had been raised to stand in rooms exactly like this one, and who had recently forgotten why. He held no glass. He spoke to no one. He simply looked at her as though she had walked into his house uninvited, and he had not yet decided whether to call for the butler or ask her to stay. She looked away first. When she looked back, he was still watching. Something was wrong. She was certain of it. The dress. Perhaps the dress was wrong, perhaps it was too fine for her station, perhaps everyone in the room could see that she was wearing borrowed silk, and the man staring at her was merely the first to find it objectionable. She had been foolish to come. She had been foolish to accept the gown. She was a clergyman's daughter from Hertfordshire, standing in 400 candles worth of London candlelight, wearing a dress that did not belong to her, and someone had noticed. She moved toward the door. He intercepted her in the corridor outside the ballroom, not by stepping into her path, but by arriving at the same door at the same moment with the unhurried precision of a man who was accustomed to rooms parting for him. "Forgive me," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected and more controlled. "I do not mean to alarm you." "You have not alarmed me," Thea said, which was a lie delivered with sufficient composure that it passed for truth. "You are leaving." "I'm taking air." He looked at her. The corridor was lit by a single candelabra on a hall table, and in that reduced light, the silver embroidery on her dress caught and held the flame in a way that made his chest tighten. "I'm the Duke of Whitmore," he said, "and I owe you an explanation for my conduct in there, though I am not certain I can give one that will make sense." "Your Grace," she curtsied, "I'm Miss Kinross, and you owe me nothing." "The dress you are wearing," he said, and then stopped. Thea looked down at the pale blue silk, as though seeing it for the first time. "It was lent to me," she said carefully, "by my relation, Mrs. Eviog. If there is something inappropriate about—" "It is not inappropriate," he paused. "It belonged to my wife." The corridor went very still. Somewhere behind them, the quartet began a new movement. Thea heard it distantly, as though the music were coming from a different evening. "Your wife," she repeated. "My late wife. She died 3 years ago. She wore that dress to the Ashfords' ball the spring before. He delivered this information with the careful precision of a man who had learned to say difficult things without inflection, because inflection was where the grief lived, and he could not afford to let it into his voice in a corridor with a stranger. I recognized the embroidery. It was commissioned by her mother. I do not believe there is another like it. Thea's hand moved to the silver thread at her bodice. She touched it lightly, as one touches something that has just changed its meaning entirely. I did not know, she said. Of course you did not. Mrs. Iva did not say. Mrs. Iva may not have known. The wardrobe was dispersed after. He stopped again. It does not matter how it came to be lent. I wished only to explain why I was staring, so that you would not think. I thought I had done something wrong, Thea said quietly. He looked at her then with something that was not grief and not recognition, but was perhaps the space between them, the place where a man who has lost everything meets a woman who has nothing, and they find, briefly, that they are standing on the same ground. You have done nothing wrong, he said. She nodded. There was a pause in which neither of them moved, and then she said, Would you prefer that I change? Mrs. Ivag's house is not far. I could... No. The word came too quickly, and he heard it, and something shifted behind his eyes. No, you should not change on my account. The dress is... He searched for the right word and did not find it. It is only silk. They both knew it was not only silk. He escorted her back into the ballroom, because it was the correct thing to do, and because, having spoken to her in a corridor without introduction or chaperone, the alternative was to leave her standing alone with a story she had not asked for. Ivas appeared at Thea's elbow within moments, sharp-eyed and assessing, and the Duke bowed and withdrew. But he did not leave the ball. He stayed for another hour, speaking to Lord Asherton, to the Whitwells, to a young MP whose name he immediately forgot. He stayed because from the second pillar he could see the pale blue silk moving through the room, and the woman inside it was dancing now. Someone had asked her, one of the Hartington sons, and she danced the way she stood, carefully, attentively, as though the steps were a language she was translating in real time. She was not graceful in the way Emmeline had been graceful. Emmeline had danced as though the music belonged to her. This woman danced as though the music had been lent, and she intended to return it in good condition. He left before the supper was announced. In the carriage, he pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose and breathed. Mrs. Cull was waiting when he returned to the house in Grosvenor Square. She had the particular stillness of a housekeeper who has been listening for the front door for 2 hours and does not wish to be caught doing so. The ball was well attended, Your Grace? It was. She waited. He did not continue. She brought him brandy, which he did not drink, and she banked the fire, which he did not watch, and she left him in the library with the single candle he preferred, and she closed the door with the gentleness of a woman who understood that her employer had returned from an evening carrying something heavier than he had taken out. He called on Mrs. Iviard 3 days later. He told himself it was a courtesy, an explanation owed for his strange behavior at the ball. Mrs. Iviard received him in her morning room with the composed surprise of a woman who has not entertained a duke before breakfast and does not intend to let on. Thea was not there. She had gone to the lending library in Piccadilly. Mr. Iva mentioned this without being asked, and Lawrence noted the information without acknowledging that he had noted it. He asked, in the most circumspect terms available to him, how Mrs. Iva had come to possess the dress. She told him, a lot purchased at an estate auction in Mayfair the previous year. She had not known the provenance. She had not known Emmeline. She was mortified. There is no cause for mortification, Lawrence said. It is a dress. Mrs. Ival looked at him with the directness of a woman who had survived 2 husbands and a revolution in hat fashions. Your Grace, she said, it is not a dress. He encountered Thea at the lending library the following week. He had not gone looking for her. He had gone looking for a volume of Herodotus that Selby had mentioned, and he found instead a young woman in a brown pelisse reading Gibbon's Decline and Fall in the history alcove with the concentration of someone who had forgotten she was in public. She was sitting on the wooden bench beneath the window, and the thin May light fell across her page in a way that reminded him, with the kind of specificity that ambushes, of the way light had fallen across Emmeline's writing desk on certain mornings. He stood at the end of the alcove for a moment before speaking, because he needed that moment to separate what he was seeing from what he was remembering, and the effort required told him something he was not yet ready to examine. "Miss Kinross." She looked up. The recognition was immediate, and with it something else, a flicker of something careful, protective, as though she were deciding in real time how much weight this encounter could bear. "Your Grace." "Gibbon," he observed. "Volume 3, she said. "I find the earlier volumes more persuasive, but the later ones are better company." He almost smiled. It was a near thing. The muscles moved, the intention formed, and then it passed, but not before she saw it. They spoke for 12 minutes. He counted afterwards in the carriage and was disturbed by the counting. They spoke about Gibbon and about Hertfordshire and about the particular quality of London light in May, which he said was thinner than country light, as though someone had watered it. She did not mention the dress. She did not mention his wife. She spoke to him as though he were a man standing in a library, which was exactly what he was and exactly what no one else seemed willing to let him be. The calls began after that. He visited Mrs. Yvage's morning room twice, then 3 times, then with a frequency that required no further pretense. Mrs. Yvage arranged the drawing room so that the best chair faced the window and ensured that the tea was always ready and that Thea was always present, and that her own presence was sufficient for propriety but insufficient for interference. She did this with the quiet engineering of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know that grief does not end. It merely finds new rooms to occupy. On the 4th visit, she was reading when he arrived, and she did not put the book down. Not from rudeness, he understood this immediately, but because she had reached a passage that required her full attention, and she trusted him to wait. He sat across from her and watched her read and felt something loosen behind his ribs that had been tight for 3 years. On the 6th visit, she disagreed with him about Pitt's legacy so precisely and so thoroughly that he forgot for perhaps 90 seconds that he was grieving. It was the longest he had gone without remembering since Emmeline died, and when the memory returned, as it always did, as reliable as tide, it arrived with something unexpected alongside it. Not guilt, permission. Mrs. Yvage observed these visits with the strategic patience of a woman playing a very long game. She never left the room entirely. Propriety required her presence, but she developed a habit of falling asleep in her chair at precisely the moment the conversation became interesting, her breathing settling into a rhythm so consistent that Thea suspected it was rehearsed. Thea did not perform for him. This was the thing he could not explain to Selby, who asked careful questions about his engagements, or to Mrs. Cull, who asked nothing, but began airing the guest chambers on the 2nd floor for no stated reason. Thea did not try to make him laugh. She did not try to make him forget. She sat across from him and spoke about books and weather and the peculiar habits of London pigeons, and when the conversation arrived at the edge of something painful, she did not retreat from it. She simply stood there at the edge with him and waited. He told her about Emmeline on a Tuesday afternoon in Mrs. Yvage's garden. The roses were not yet in bloom. It was too early, but the beds had been turned and the air smelled of damp soil and new growth, and something about the rawness of the garden made it easier to speak. He told her that Emmeline had been fierce and funny and terrible at watercolors, that she had argued with him about everything, politics, horses, the correct temperature for tea, and that their arguments had been the architecture of their marriage, the way 2 walls leaning against each other hold up a roof. That she had read to him in the evenings, badly, with voices for the characters that bore no resemblance to any human sound, and that he had loved it. That she had died of a fever that took 4 days, and that he had been in the room for all of them, and that on the 2nd day she had looked at him and said, "You will be unbearable about this, Lawrence. Do try not to be unbearable forever." That the dress, the pale blue silk, had been her favorite, and that she had worn it the last time they danced together, and that he had not been able to find it afterwards and had assumed it had been packed away with her things and dispersed, which it had, which was how it ended up in Mrs. Yvage's wardrobe, and then on the body of a woman who stood against walls at balls and read Gibbon in lending libraries, and who was not Emmeline and was not trying to be, and was, for reasons he could not articulate, the first person in 3 years who made him feel that the world contained something other than the space where Emmeline had been. Thea listened to all of it. She did not cry. She did not reach for his hand. She sat on the stone bench with her hands folded in her lap, and she received the whole of it, the way the ground receives rain, Not dramatically, not with spectacle, but completely. When he finished, she said, "She sounds like someone who would have been very impatient with you for standing still this long." It was not what he expected. It was not what anyone had said. Everyone else had said variations of, "She would have wanted you to be happy," which was both true and useless, because wanting and having are not the same verb. Thea had said something different. She had said, "Your wife would have argued with you about this and she would have been right." He proposed 6 weeks later, in the same garden, beside the same bench. The roses were in bloom by then. He did not kneel. His knee had troubled him since a fall from a horse the previous winter. But he stood before her with his hands at his sides and said, "I'm not offering you a man without history. I'm offering you a man with too much of it, and asking whether you would be willing to make more." Thea looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light, London light, thin and watered, fell across his face, and she saw in it the same expression he had worn in the corridor at Lady Whitwell's ball. Not recognition, not grief, but the space between them, which was also the space where something new could grow. "I would not wish to replace her," Thea said. "You could not," he said. "That is not what I am asking." "What are you asking?" "I'm asking you to be what comes next." She said yes. Not immediately. There was a pause in which she looked at the roses and at the turned earth and at the bench where he had told her about a woman who had argued with him about the temperature of tea. And in that pause, she understood that she was not being asked to fill a space, but to stand beside one. That the shape Emmeline had left in his life would remain, and that her own shape would be different, and that a marriage built on that understanding would be stronger than one built on forgetting. She wrote to tell him so the following morning, a letter of 3 paragraphs, precise and unhurried, in which she said that she would marry him knowing exactly who had come before, and that she would not compete with a memory, because memories do not compete. They simply remain. He read the letter twice in his study, and then placed it in the drawer of his writing desk, beside a bundle of older letters tied in faded blue ribbon that he had not opened in 2 years. The 2 sets of correspondence sat side by side without contradiction. Mrs. Iver, upon being informed, poured herself a second glass of wine at luncheon, an unprecedented act, and said, "Well, I had hoped, but I had not presumed." The wedding was quiet. St. George's, Hanover Square, a Tuesday morning, 30 guests. Mrs. Iva sat in the second pew and wept with the practiced restraint of a woman who had attended enough weddings to know which tears were permitted and which were not. Selby stood near the vestry door, his face arranged in the expression of professional neutrality that stewards adopt at events they have privately been hoping for. Mrs. Cull had overseen the breakfast preparations with the intensity of a woman who understood that the first meal of a new marriage sets the tone for all subsequent meals. Thea wore ivory muslin with a Spencer jacket. She did not wear the pale blue silk. She would not have considered it, and he would not have asked, and neither of them mentioned it, which was itself a kind of understanding. It was Mrs. Cull who raised the matter, 3 months into the marriage, with the oblique directness that was her particular gift. She found Thea in the morning room, the Duchess's morning room, which Thea was still learning to think of as hers, reviewing the household accounts that Mrs. Cull brought her each Friday. "Your Grace," Mrs. Cull said, "there is a trunk in the attic. It contains several items that belonged to the late Duchess. His Grace asked some time ago that they be stored. I wondered whether you wished them to remain, or whether you had a preference." Thea set down the accounts. "What sort of items?" "Books, some correspondence, a few garments." Mrs. Cull paused with the precision of a woman choosing her next word from a very short list. "Including a dress." Thea understood. She sat with the understanding for a moment, turning it over the way she turned pages, carefully, without creasing. "Leave the trunk where it is," she said. "It is not mine to decide." Mrs. Cull nodded. "Very good, Your Grace." But that evening, after dinner, when they sat in the library together, he with his parliamentary papers from the House of Lords, she with her volume of Gibbon, now on volume 5, Thea said, "Mrs. Cull mentioned the trunk." He looked up. His expression did not change, but his hand stilled on the page. "I told her to leave it," Thea said, "but I think it should not stay in the attic. It should be somewhere you can reach it when you wish to." He was quiet for a long time. The fire cracked. The candles, beeswax, 6 of them, which Mrs. Cull kept trimmed to precisely the same height, cast the room in the warm amber light that Thea had come to associate with this hour, this room, this version of her life that she was still learning to believe was real. "The dressing room," he said finally, "the cabinet beside the window." "Yes? You would not mind?" "Lawrence," she said, and it was still new enough, his name in her mouth, that they both heard it. "I did not marry you in spite of her. I married you because of who you became in the years after her. She is part of that. I would not subtract her." He set down his papers. He crossed the room. He took her hand, not dramatically, not with the urgency of a man in the grip of passion, but with the steadiness of a man who has just been told something he needed to hear and is holding on to the person who said it. The dress was moved to the dressing room cabinet the following morning. It remained there, folded in tissue, undisturbed and undenied. Thea passed it daily and thought nothing of it, which was perhaps the kindest thing she could have done. To treat it as what it was, which was evidence of a life fully lived and fully loved, no more threatening than a portrait on a wall or a name in a family Bible. The following spring, Lady Penrose hosted a ball. It was Lady Penrose who had provided the introduction that brought Mrs. Iva into the Whitwell orbit, and she had followed the courtship with the proprietary satisfaction of a woman who believes she has arranged something that was, in fact, arranged by a borrowed dress in a lending library and the specific quality of London light in May. Thea wore green silk. She danced with her husband, all of the dances, not because it was expected, but because he asked and she accepted, and because neither of them was performing for the room. They danced the way they did everything, attentively without spectacle, with the particular grace of two people who had arrived at each other by accident and chosen to stay on purpose. From across the ballroom, Mrs. Ivas watched them. She was standing near the far wall, in the position Thea had occupied a year earlier, and she held her glass of ratafia and observed the Duke of Whitmore dancing with his second wife with an expression that was not triumph and not sentimentality, but was perhaps the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had opened a wardrobe one morning without knowing what it would set in motion. Selby, who had accompanied the household to town for the season, reported to Mrs. Cull that the Duke had danced 5 dances and laughed once. Mrs. Cull received this intelligence with a nod that managed to convey both professional acknowledgement and profound personal relief. In the dressing-room cabinet at Grosvenor Square, the pale blue silk rested in its tissue, silver embroidery catching no light at all. It did not need to. It had done its work. It had walked into a ballroom on the wrong woman and become, through no intention of its own, the door through which the right one entered. The autumn brought a daughter. They named her Emmeline, and Thea suggested it, and Lawrence did not speak for several minutes after she did. And when he finally said yes, his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with refusal, and everything to do with the fact that some gifts arrive so precisely that they leave no room for composure. Young Emmeline had her father's dark hair and her mother's habit of watching. She watched from her cradle, from her nursemaid's arms, from the morning room floor where Thea set her on a blanket and reviewed household accounts while the baby observed the ceiling with the grave concentration of someone cataloging a new world. On the anniversary of the first ball, Lady Whitwell's, the 400 candles, the corridor, Lawrence found Thea in the library. She was reading. She was always reading. Young Emmeline was asleep upstairs, and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a winter evening, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full, the way a room is full when it contains everything it needs. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said, that she would have been impatient with me for standing still." Thea looked up. "You were right," he said. "She would have been furious. She would have called me a fool and thrown something, probably a book. She had a particular fondness for throwing books, and told me that I was wasting the one life I had been given." "She sounds formidable." She was, and she would have liked you, which she would have found extremely irritating because she did not like being predictable. Thea closed her book. She did not set it down. She held it in her lap, one finger marking her place as though she intended to return to it, but not yet. "I think," she said, "that I would have liked her too, and I think she would have told me to stop reading so much and go for more walks. She would have told you that your taste in historians was pedestrian and then borrowed your copy of Gibbon and never returned it. Then she and I would have had our first argument." "Yes," Lawrence said, and she would have enjoyed it enormously. They sat together in the library until the candles burned low. In the dressing-room cabinet, the pale blue silk kept its shape in the tissue. In the nursery above, young Emmeline slept with her fists curled and her face turned toward the window, where the London light, thin and watered, was already beginning to pale into morning. They arrive here, like a dress worn without knowing its history, whenever they are ready.